So here we're going to look at Hinduism and just give a very brief introduction to it. And the challenging thing about Hinduism is that it's really a massive religion. And in fact, it's not even a single religion in and to itself. It's actually a conglomeration of numerous religious traditions and concepts and cultural traditions going back thousands of years. So what's true for one Hindu may or may not be true for another. And there's a whole lot of diversity in Hinduism. If we were to really get into the nuts and bolts of it and all the different strands of it, there's really almost a seemingly infinite amount of material out there. And as far as a lot of the ancient scriptures and writings and things like that, a lot of it I don't think has even been translated into English yet. So there's a massive amount of information that can qualify as going into Hinduism. But nevertheless, there are certain terms and concepts and ideas, theologies, ideologies. There are common strands, common themes that run throughout all the different kinds of what can be described as Hindu traditions. So we're going to look at just some of those common themes and just kind of give you a general idea of some common themes and practices that you'll find in religious traditions in India. So, as far as we can tell, some artifacts and signs of what would later come to be known as Vedic tradition, Hindu related tradition, goes all the way back to about 2500 BC. So that's about as far back as we have evidence suggesting that anything resembling Hinduism existed. So we're going with about 2500 BC as the date around which it originated, and of course originated in India. Hinduism is indigenous to India, was founded along the Indus River, and there is, of course, no single founder, because as I said, it's a conglomeration of multiple different religious traditions and customs in India. And Hinduism as a term wasn't coined until about 1830. So the idea of being a Hindu is connected to the Indus River and the Indus River Valley civilization going back thousands of years. But the actual term Hinduism to describe just a massive quilt with tons of threads that all kind of come together, and we're putting it under this banner called Hinduism, that's a relatively new concept. So about 1830 is when it's believed to have become a term. Hinduism, then, if you take it all together, it's about the third largest world religion after Christianity and Islam, about 1.15 billion followers in the world, and in the US about 2.4 million, which is actually an increase from just a few years ago. So what are some of the key concepts that we find in Hinduism? Well, one of the main concepts is the cycle of rebirth known as samsara. Now, many of you probably already know the most popular thing about Hinduism is its belief in reincarnation. And so reincarnation is seen as kind of a bothersome thing in Hinduism, and really the idea is to try to do the best we can within this cycle of rebirth and see if we can be reincarnated into something better in the next life than what we currently are right now. Or better yet, let's see if we can totally escape samsara, this cycle of rebirth. So how do we do that? Well, there's three different major paths. So there's the path of action, karma, the path of knowledge, or the path of devotion. So different Hindus choose different paths or different variations of these paths. And so karma and action is, and many of you have heard the term karma, and it's usually associated with, well, what goes around comes around. Well, that's actually not what it means. Karma just literally means action. So doing sacrifices, appeasing multiple gods and ancestors to generate good karma for a better next life. So if you want to be reincarnated into something better in your next life, then you want to perform good karma. You want to perform sacrifices. So depending on which god or gods you worship, or whether you're venerating your ancestors, or whatever your particular tradition is, you want to make sure that you're performing the right sacrifices and doing those sacrifices the right way. So for those of you who are Christians or Jews, think of Leviticus, how there are very specific commands and requirements for doing certain kinds of sacrifices. So we see this concept here in Hinduism as well. So the idea is that if you die having achieved more good karma than bad karma, then you'll be reincarnated into something better than what you are now. So traditionally, if you're a woman, then you may be reincarnated into a man, right? And this is very just traditional Vedic ideology. That doesn't mean that all Hindus mean that women are less than men or anything like that. That's just an example of traditionally how this kind of thing was seen in centuries past. So on the other hand, if you have more bad karma than good karma, if you fail to do all the sacrifices and do all the things that you need to do, then you may be reincarnated into a bug or something in your next life. So it's sort of a ladder that you can go up or down. And really there's different ideas. Depending on which Hindu tradition you're looking at, but for the most part, for a Hindu, what a Hindu does is more important than what a Hindu believes. So a very big distinction between other religions like Christianity. So if you're a Hindu, then what you do is a lot more important than what you believe. Again, I have to say this over and over again, that's not necessarily the case for all Hindus. There are actually some types of Hindus that believe, like what Protestant Christians believe, that you're saved, or that you're in good standing with whatever God you're worshiping based on grace alone by faith alone. So there's the idea of a mother cat picking up and carrying her kitten, just picking her up in the mouth. And it's like, we're the kitten. So we're not doing anything to earn our salvation or anything like that. We're just being, God is picking us up and carrying us and doing all the work. And so with Protestantism and Christianity, especially Reformed Protestantism, there's a big parallel there. There's also other Hindus that believe that, more like what Roman Catholics would believe, that salvation is a combination of works and faith, that you have to have both. And so again, there's just a million different kinds of, and by million I'm just speaking hyperbole, but there's a lot of different traditions throughout Hinduism. And to really know what a Hindu believes, any particular person who's a Hindu, I wouldn't try to assume very much. You want to talk to them and figure out which of these things they believe and which of these things they reject, because it's a very broad umbrella. There may be multiple people under that umbrella, and some of them may not even recognize each other as far as what they believe and what path they follow. But there's, the idea in Hinduism that there are multiple paths that lead to the divine or the afterlife or whatever. So theoretically, you could be a Hindu and be a Christian, or you could be a Hindu and be a Muslim. So, the idea of, there's multiple paths that can get you up to the top of the mountain. Doesn't matter which way you go, just as long as you get to the top of the mountain. So another path that is chosen is the path of devotion, Bhakti, and we see that manifested very clearly in the Bhagavad-Gita, and one of the primary and most popular scriptures in Hinduism, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Also, the path of knowledge, which is comprised of yoga, meditation, and renunciation. So many of you know what yoga is as far as the movements and the exercise, but for the practicing Hindu, there's a lot more to it than that. So you have to not only do the right movements, but you have to focus, you have to meditate, and you have to follow the path of renunciation in some cases. So there's also what's known as a sadhu. The sadhus are Hindus that they're kind of like, they're wandering ascetics. So they've renounced the things of the world. They've renounced riches and comforts and things like that in order to more closely be united with the divine. And so these guys are seeking to completely circumvent samsara, the cycle of rebirth. They're looking to totally get around it. And so there's some really good videos I would recommend if you want to get a closer look at this. Like the life of a sadhu is one of them. And so we see what some of these guys do, and they'll do things that are uncomfortable just for the sake of being uncomfortable. I mean, there are certain ones that will never sit down again for the rest of their life. They stand up. They won't sit down. They won't lay down. They'll just stand up. And if they have to rest, they'll lean up against something, but they never sit down for the rest of their lives. Or they might just lift an arm up in the air and leave that arm raised there until the muscular, atrophy sets in, and the arm is kind of frozen that way, and they'll just leave it like that. So they do things kind of like I forget the name of the type of monks that lived in the Middle Ages, that they would basically flog themselves and do things like that in order to cause themselves pain and discomfort in order to achieve a closer unity with the divine. So we see a lot of that amongst the renouncers. They're also known to smoke marijuana in order to have a closer communion with the divine. So there's different paths that you can take. Now, Dharma is a very broad and very loaded concept in Hinduism and in Buddhism as well. It can refer to righteousness. It can also refer to ultimate reality, so the great ultimate. And it can also refer to cosmic law and obligation, so the types of things that you're required to do. It can refer to moral codes, which again plays into the idea of righteousness. So Dharma means a lot of different things. It can mean anything from just the great ultimate, the great reality, whatever that is, whatever that looks like. Kind of like the concept of the Logos, which I talked about in the first systematic theology video that we see in John 1:1. So the idea of the Logos, which was borrowed from the Greek-speaking world. And then we see the concept of the Tao in Taoism, which is known as the way, like capital W, way. And so we kind of see that here with Dharma, just the ultimate divine cosmic principle, but also there's some law, duty, obligation that's involved in that as well. Now, another thing that India is known for and Hinduism is known for that's not really practiced anymore, at least not in mainstream culture. It may be in certain areas, certain corners of India, but it's been outlawed to my knowledge and is not commonly practiced, at least not in mainstream cultures, but is the caste system. So you have the priestly class, which is the Brahmins, and then the nobility class, which is your kings and your warriors. And kind of like we saw in the Middle Ages in Christianity, where there's this constant back and forth between this power struggle between popes and emperors. We've seen that kind of thing in the history of India too, between the priestly class and the nobility class, because they kind of depend on each other. The nobility class relies on the Brahmins to perform certain sacrifices that only the Brahmins are eligible to do. So kind of like when certain popes would, and I think Pope Innocent III would do this a lot. He would, if someone upset him, if an emperor or a king made him mad, then he would place the king's region under papal interdict, which means that no one in that region is able to take communion or do any of the sacraments, which for Roman Catholics means you need the sacraments to be eligible for heaven. I mean, it's a part of your salvation. So being able to perform the Eucharist and the last rites and things like that. And so this power struggle where you kind of have almost a symbiotic relationship where the religious leadership and the secular leadership kind of depend on each other. I think it was, again, Pope Innocent III that said that the religious rulers, the theological leaders, were kind of like the sun, and the secular rulers were the moon. So they had a much lesser light, and they were dependent on on the light of the sun for their own light. So you see this same kind of of power struggle between the priestly class and the nobility, the kings and the warriors. Because, again, they kind of depend on each other. So the priestly class, the Brahmins, will depend on the kings, the nobility, to have the benefits and the rights and things that are afforded by the state. But again, the kings need the Brahmins to perform sacrifices that they themselves are not eligible to perform. Then there's the common class, also known as the householder, and these are upper class citizens. So these top three classes here, these the priest, nobility, and the householders, these are the top three classes that are considered twice born. So if you're in this class, it means that you've been reincarnated at least a couple of times, and you've done the karma to get to that particular level. Now, how do you know that? Well, it depends on where you're born. So if you're born to parents in the priestly class or the nobility, or if you're born into the householder level, then you are obviously, that's a sign that you have been storing good karma from previous lives. So if you're a householder, you must fulfill 3 debts before seeking liberation. So you have to study the Veda scriptures as a celibate student. And then from that point, then you become a householder, and you have to perform rituals to the gods and to ancestors. And there are passages in the Vedas, especially the Yajur Veda, that talks about how to perform those. So kind of like Leviticus in the Old Testament. And then begetting a son to perform these rituals. Now, what if you can't beget a son for whatever reason? What if you're like King Henry VIII and you can only beget daughters for the longest time? Well, then you're kind of out of luck, I guess. I don't know. So aside from fulfilling the 3 debts, you can become a hermit and forest dweller, and that's optional, just depending on your spiritual goals. So you can become a forest dweller. That's kind of like being a renouncer, but it's I forget all the details behind that, but you basically become you just become a hermit, you become a forest dweller. So you're not renouncing all comforts and all worldliness. You just kind of go off and retreat and live on your own in the forest. And I've heard of Catholic monks doing this as well. And then, of course, there's the renouncer, which we've already talked about, and that's sort of like a friar in the Roman Catholic tradition, where it's someone who is basically reliant on alms and different things given to them just to survive. But they're wandering from place to place, and they're preaching and teaching and talking about the way to achieve enlightenment, to achieve freedom from the cycle of samsara, of reincarnation. And again, these are the guys that are willing to do all kinds of things to bring on discomfort and stay away from the things of the world, the things of comfort and prosperity and riches. They totally eschew all that. They don't want anything to do with that. They've devoted their lives to being completely committed to their spiritual well-being. But unlike the hermit and forest dweller, they're going out and wandering. And during the rainy season, they don't do it as much, but especially when weather permits, they're going out and wandering and begging, and they're sharing their teachings and things like that. And then there's the servant class, lower class citizens, which I believe is the Sudras, the Sudra class. And with these guys, you're considered part of society, but you're the lowest level of it. And then there's the Untouchables, which I think of kind of like the lepers in the in the ancient Jewish culture, where they had to, wherever they went, they had to yell out that they were unclean, so people would stay away from them. So the Untouchables are often, these are the social outcasts, and they tend to be the offspring of Brahmins, like Brahmin or nobility males, and Sudra women. So the very fact that you were born out of a union like that, which is considered illegitimate, makes you illegitimate. And so the Untouchables kind of have their own communities and things like that because they weren't allowed to be part of the actual society. So not particularly a fun way to live. But again, I think the caste system has been outlawed in India. I'm sure it's still practiced in some places, but it's not something that I don't think we see a whole lot in mainstream Indian culture anymore. And I could be wrong about that. So as far as deities, Hinduism is known as a polytheistic deity, meaning they believe in many gods, and that's true in one sense, but in another sense it is not true because there's an estimated 330 million gods in the Hindu pantheon, but many Hindus actually express devotion to one god, and they consider all other gods just a manifestation of that one god. So one of the most popular, best known, and oldest gods in Hinduism is the god Vishnu. Now, Vishnu has, I think, 10 different incarnations. And also Krishna, who's very popular these days. You have the Hare Krishna movement became very popular in the 20th century, and Krishna is the focal point of the Bhagavad-Gita, which we'll look at here in a little bit. Krishna is considered a manifestation of Vishnu by a lot of Hindus. So there are entire movements dedicated to certain gods. So I'm not even going to try to pronounce the words, but there are entire schools of Hinduism that are devoted to following Vishnu. Same thing with Shiva. Same thing with Devi, the goddess. And here again, each of these gods have there's different focal points. There's different perspectives on how they are observed, how they're worshipped, different forms that they take on. And so with Vishnu, and I'm actually reading here from the book An Introduction to Hinduism by Dr. Gavin Flood. It's a really good book as far as being introduced to Hinduism, although it's a ton of information. It's almost like an information overload, so you want to kind of go through it slowly if you can and just kind of absorb it as much as possible. So, but when describing the 10 different incarnations of Vishnu, there's the fish, the tortoise, the boar, the man-lion, the dwarf, and then Parasurama, which is the deity Rama with the axe, and then there's Rama himself, and then Krishna, Buddha, and Kalki. So yeah, you read that. So you heard that right. Buddha, by some followers of Vishnu, is simply considered to be the 9th incarnation of Vishnu. And a lot of followers of Vishnu have a specific cosmology, the idea of how the earth came to be. And so this is how it goes. The mythology of these incarnations focuses upon the creation, destruction, and recreation of the cosmos. Now let me stop right there for a second and say there's the well-known concept of the Hindu Trinity. So there's Brahma, who's the creator. There's Vishnu, who is sort of the sustainer or a preserver. Then there is Shiva, who we'll get to in a second, who is the destroyer. So that's the Hindu Trinity. Now Brahma is not really worshipped or very popular in Hinduism anymore. This is more of a concept of the past, but just to kind of give you an idea of the basis of what these deities are known for, what kind of concepts they're closely identified with. So Vishnu and Shiva are still very popular and have a lot of followers, but I don't really hear much about Brahma anymore. I don't think that's a god that is particularly well known, but back in the Vedic period, I think he was known as the creator, whereas Vishnu was a preserver and Shiva was the destroyer. So the mythology of these incarnations focuses upon the creation, destruction, and recreation of the cosmos. The Matsya Purana tells how the first man, Manu, is saved from a cosmic deluge by the fish. And that's Vishnu's first incarnation, the fish. Then his second incarnation, the tortoise, places himself at the bottom of the ocean of milk as the support for the mountain Mandara, which is then used as a stick by the gods and demons to churn the cosmic ocean from which various desired and undesired objects emerge, including the nectar of immortality. The boar, who's also the incarnation of Vishnu, rescues the earth, personified as a goddess, from the bottom of the cosmic ocean and brings her to the surface where he spreads her out, piles up mountains, and divides her into 7 continents. How do I pronounce this? Narasimha, the man lion, destroys the wicked demon who has tried to destroy his son, a devotee of Vishnu. The dwarf then strides across the universe in 3 steps and destroys the demon Bali. Parasurama is incarnated to destroy the arrogant people who threaten the Brahmins, while Ramakandra and Krishna are the hero kings of the epics. The Buddha is a curious inclusion in this list, an incarnation sent to lead the wicked and the demons astray, and so to hasten the end of the current age of darkness. Lastly, Kalki, the white horse, will come at the end of the dark age to destroy the wicked and to restore purity and righteousness. We see in these incarnations a movement from lower aquatic life forms to higher life forms living on the land. So this is interesting. So you see the entire, an entire cosmological framework there where all the different incarnations of Vishnu play some specific role, and it also correlates with kind of the idea of evolution, how, whether you believe in evolution or not, the idea that all of life as it is now on land evolved from ancient marine life. So that's kind of worked into it as well. And then you have Shiva, I think Shiva is a pretty interesting character. Now, Shiva is often associated with destruction, and as we said, he was considered the destroyer in the ancient Hindu Trinity. He's also seen as an ascetic, so kind of like a lot of the renouncers, the sadhus that we talked about. A lot of them look to Shiva for a lot of their inspiration. And you see Shiva there, he's dancing on a dwarf, and I can't remember for sure, but I think that dwarf is supposed to represent desire. So you have this idea amongst a lot of Hindus, and I think this flows over into Buddhism as well, that craving or desire is the root of a lot of suffering and can prevent us from escaping the cycle of rebirth at samsara. So if we want to escape reincarnation and we want to, achieve ultimate enlightenment, then we need to be able to trample on desire, and that's what Shiva is doing there. So Shiva is portrayed as the Lord of the Yoga, where he's meditating, often portrayed as covered in ashes with a third eye with which he burned desire with his matted locks and a crescent moon in his hair, the Ganges river pouring from his locks, garlanded by a snake and sacred beads, seated upon a tiger skin and holding a trident. So pretty interesting image there. He's also portrayed sometimes as the family man with his wife, the goddess Parvati, and their 2 sons, Skanda and the elephant-headed Ganesha, with the sacred bull Nandi standing nearby. Now Ganesha, I don't have a picture of him here, but he's the elephant-headed god who is considered to be the remover of obstacles. So whether it's a spiritual obstacle or whether you go on a long trip traveling somewhere, a lot of Hindus will pray to Ganesha for safety in travel because he is the remover of obstacles. So he is considered a son of Shiva. He's also portrayed as the Lord of the Dance, and you see in that picture there he is dancing, who in his awe-inspiring dance he expresses his boundless energy, creates, maintains, and destroys the cosmos. He is 4-armed, dancing upon the dwarf of ignorance. Oh, okay, so I was wrong. That dwarf there represents ignorance. But we see him with his third eye burning and destroying desire. So, I guess I sort of got it right, but sort of got my wires crossed a little bit when it comes to the different functions or incarnations of Shiva. But anyway, so there, that dwarf that he's dancing on is ignorance. And of course, we saw earlier in an earlier slide that one of the paths that can be chosen by Hindus is the path of knowledge, and that's the path of knowledge is the route of practicing yoga, and that's not only through the movements but through meditation as well, where you try to reach a higher state of consciousness and higher state of awareness. You reach a higher plane of existence as you meditate, and this cosmic force, this energy rises up within you. And so when you reach that state of enlightenment, and you're kind of getting into Buddhist territory here as well, you are becoming aware for the first time of reality, of things as they really are. And so that's why you see Shiva dancing on ignorance right there. That makes sense, that Shiva's dancing on a dwarf that represents ignorance. So desire can be bad, but ignorance can also be bad. That's, a common ideology throughout different strands of Hinduism as well as in Buddhism itself. So we don't want to give in to desire, but we don't want to be ignorant either. So this idea of being aware and having a knowledge of reality kind of reminds me of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, where he differentiates between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. So there's the noumenal world, which are things in and of themselves which we cannot perceive, because by definition it's reality that is independent of sense perception. And then there's the phenomenal world, which is the things as we observe them. So we really have no way of knowing to what extent the things that we observe correspond to true reality. And so that's one of the goals, I think, of some Hindus, a lot of Hindus, especially the renouncers who emulate Shiva, as they're seeking to gain that higher level of knowledge, that higher consciousness, and they obtain that through, trying to get rid of comforts and desires and anything that may hold them back from spiritual progress and spiritual enlightenment, but they're also seeking to increase that knowledge. So Shiva is also portrayed as the icon found in most Hindu temples, known as a linga. The linga represents a phallus within a vulva. So there you go. Symbolic of the union of Shiva with his dynamic energy, or Sakti. So with Shiva, you see a lot of aggression, a lot of destruction, but also a lot of asceticism and a lot of eroticism. So asceticism, eroticism, destruction, these are ideas and concepts that really, I think, well describe Shiva. And so next we'll look at the goddess Devi. And I put bookmarks in this book, and now they've fallen down into the book, and so I have, it completely eradicates the purpose of said bookmark. So now I'm having to waste time and okay, here we go, I found it. So different manifestations of the goddess as well. So Devi's best known incarnation is that of Durga. And that's kind of an ugly sounding name, and it should sound ugly because Durga is a very aggressive and very destructive goddess. She's very angry. So you want to make sacrifices to Durga just to keep her from, either destroying you or destroying your crops, or, you just want to placate her. So she's portrayed as Durga, the slayer of the buffalo demon. And she's seated on or attended by a lion or tiger. Durga, the difficult to access, has 10 arms and weapons, kicks and pierces Mahisha, and Mahisha. Mahisha is the buffalo demon referred to a minute ago, with her trident, and beheads him while yet maintaining a calm and detached demeanor. So she's portrayed as wiping out this buffalo demon and being very calm and serene while she does it. So you can kind of see in that picture there, I don't see 10 arms, but she definitely has more than one. So it looks like, I see looks like 4 arms there, but could be a lot more that I'm just not seeing. But that's Devi. She's also portrayed as Kali and other terrible manifestations. There are emaciated, blood-drinking, and violent form. So Kali is another very, very dark and violent manifestation of this particular deity. Blood-drinking, violent forms who haunt the cremation grounds. Kali is black or blue, garlanded with severed heads, girdled with severed arms, with rolling intoxicated eyes and a lolling tongue. She dances on the corpse of her husband Shiva. Who would want to marry that? I mean, I don't know if Shiva married that. I think he got what was coming to him. Anyway, so the goddess is also portrayed as consorts or energies of the gods, particularly Sarasvati, Parvati, and Lakshmi, the consorts of Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, who are beautiful models of wifely and maternal devotion, although not devoid of righteous anger. We also see the goddess manifested as groups of generally ferocious female deities, notably the seven mothers, whose natures are ambiguous, preying on children, yet also destroying demons. So they prey on children, but at least they are destroying demons. So there you go. In esoteric tantric literature, they are associated with letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, and the goddess, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. The goddess is the deity of the complete alphabet. She's also portrayed as the local or regional icons in a village or family shrines and temples. Local goddesses are often goddesses of smallpox or other pustular diseases. And she's also portrayed in forms such as stones, poles, weapons, magical diagrams, stylized female genitals, and as natural phenomena, particularly rivers, lakes, trees, and groves. And also as male and female mediums possessed by a goddess, particularly during festivals. So you could go on and on and on about all the different deities in Hinduism, but these are really the top three. And again, many Hindus will say that they believe in one of these deities, but that all the other gods are simply manifestations of that one god. So many Hindus are monotheistic, but they can also be described as heterotheistic because they believe in many manifestations that are deities, but those are manifestations of a single god. So there are, of course, there's many different kinds of everything in Hinduism. There are also many different scriptures. So probably the most ancient and best known scriptures in Hinduism are the Vedas. And Veda literally means knowledge. Now the content of the Vedas are usually neglected by Hindu traditions. It's just more of a reference point for the construction of Hindu self-identity and self-understanding. The main purpose of the Vedas are to reveal the Dharma, which we talked about Dharma as Dharma in the concept of cosmic law or duty or obligation or righteousness. So if you're performing works to display your righteousness in order to earn good karma, we take Dharma in that sense. That's what the Vedas communicate. So there's 4 different groups of Vedas or Veda. That's the Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharvaveda. The Rig Veda consisted of 10 books of 1,028 hymns to various deities. They're composed over several hundred years, and they're also the oldest and most important sources of knowledge about Vedic religion and society. Then there's the Sama Veda, which are books of songs based on the Rig Veda with instructions for proper recitation. The Yajur Veda is a collection of ritual formulae, which is composed of 2 different types. There's the black Yajur Vedas and the white Yajur Veda. The black are 3 books, and they're comprised of both prose and verses, and then the white Yajur Veda is simply 1 book, and it's verses only, comprised entirely of verses. The Atharvaveda is a collection of hymns and magical formulae that was compiled around 900 BC or so. It's considered inferior to the other 3 collections of Veda, and there's less connection with sacrifice. So you look at the Rig, Yajur, and Sama Vedas, and they're really if you want to compare it to something that most of you will be familiar with, which is the Bible, kind of a combination of Leviticus and Psalms. So instructions for properly performing certain kinds of sacrifices, but also songs of devotion. Now, the main deity that's referenced in the Vedas is Indra, which is the god of storm and war. And so Indra has jurisdiction over a lot of different things in the Vedas, and he's the one that's referenced the most. Indra is no longer I think a well-known deity in Hinduism. I think probably a lot of Hindus would say that he's just simply a manifestation of Vishnu or something like that. But at any event, Indra is the primary deity that's referenced in the Vedas, but I think it's inconsequential because the whole idea is simply to give instructions on how to perform certain sacrifices and things like that. It's just a reference point, as I said earlier. And even within these 4 different types of Vedas, they're divided into categories. So there's the Samhitas, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. And we'll get to the Upanishads here in a minute. So even with the Rig Veda, you have the Rig Veda Samhitas, the Rig Veda Brahmanas, the Rig Veda Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. So among each group of Veda, you have all these different types within that. So all these subgroups. So it's a little bit difficult to keep track of, as you would imagine. But here again, the Vedas are not the most popular text that's used today with Hindus. That's sort of representative of a bygone era within Hinduism. And like it says there, they're on the slide, they were composed between 1500 and 500 BC. That's known as the Vedic period. So from 2500 to 1500, that was the ancient period where we first start seeing the earliest signs of what would be known as various religious and cultural traditions that would become absorbed into what would be known as Hinduism. So there's that ancient period, and those are the formative years. But after that, the next 1,000 years, 1500 to 500 BC, is the Vedic period. And so you can kind of get an idea of how Hinduism has changed and evolved over time, just with their different types of scriptures. So in 500 BC to 500 AD, this is the period of the epics. So there are 2 epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is the largest epic poem in the world with 100,000 verses. So it's a poem that tells a story, so kind of like Paradise Lost or The Fairy Queen or something like that we're familiar with in British literature, or Dante's Divine Comedy. So this is just a long poem that tells a story, and like I said, it's extremely long. It's 100,000 verses. And it simply tells the story of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And these are cousins who basically are battling for control of a kingdom. And the Pandavas end up winning that particular battle, as the story goes. Now, the Bhagavad-Gita, this is where you really want to pay attention, because the Bhagavad-Gita, you can see it there on the screen in the picture in the lower left-hand corner. That's my copy of the Bhagavad-Gita. And again, that's just a part of the longer epic, the Mahabharata. And so the Bhagavad-Gita shows the warrior Arjuna, and he's talking to another warrior, and he's saying, hey, I don't feel right about this. You know, we're fighting with our cousins, and I just don't like the idea of having to fight against and kill my cousins. This just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem proper with what we know of, Vedic teaching. It doesn't seem like proper duty or obligation. And the warrior that he talks to is giving him advice and telling him, well, actually, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you perform the duty that you have been given to do by God, because ultimately it is devotion that matters. Your devotion to God and your willingness to do whatever God commands you to do. So Bhagavad Gita literally means the song of the Lord. And in that picture there on the cover, you see that blue god right there. I believe that's Krishna, because Arjuna is talking to this warrior who's giving him all this advice, and they're talking back and forth, and it's gradually revealed more and more throughout this particular event, this conversation, that Arjuna is talking to Krishna. And Krishna, like I said, has been considered historically a manifestation of Vishnu. But in the years following the Bhagavad-Gita, you had what's known as the Hare Krishna movement, which is characterized by devotion, also known as, as Bhakti in the Sanskrit term. So Krishna is emphasizing devotion, duty, obligation. And so everything that you do, as long as you're doing it in obedience to God, that's really what matters. So yeah, you're in this war, you're having to fight against and kill your cousins, but in this particular instance, that's okay because you are following God's will. You're acting as a result of devotion to God. And I'm just going to read this little short passage right here. This is Krishna talking. He's talking to Arjuna. He's saying, "You've seen this form of mine, which is difficult to be perceived, and which even the gods are always anxious to behold. But I am not to be seen, even as I have shown myself to thee, by study of the Vedas, nor by mortifications, nor almsgiving, nor sacrifices. I am to be approached and seen and known in truth by means of that devotion which has me alone as the object. He whose actions are for me alone, who esteems me the supreme goal, who is my servant only, without attachment to the results of action and free from enmity towards any creature, cometh to me, O son of Pandu." So notice what he says here, that devotion, so it's all about devotion that has me, Krishna, alone as the object. And so the consequences don't really matter. The consequences are of no consequence. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the action itself and the motive behind that action, where it's being performed as a result of devotion. So having me as your object of worship, setting me in the highest esteem and doing everything that you do for my sake, that's the bottom line. So the consequences of the actions don't really matter. It's the idea of devotion that is very significant. And the Bhagavad-Gita is not very long. Again, it's just a very, very small clip of this extremely long poem, the Mahabharata, this long epic. So next we have the Ramayana. So the epics, this is the second of the two epics, and this is the story of King Rama. And that story basically goes where Rama is a prince who marries a princess of a nearby kingdom named Sita, and Rama's father, who is the king, his father's second wife, for whatever reason, is kind of out to get Rama, just doesn't like him that much, so she makes his father banish him from the kingdom, and so Rama has to leave the kingdom with his wife Sita, and his brother actually goes along with them. Sita is then abducted by Ravana, the 10-headed demon king of Sri Lanka, and Rama eventually wins her back with the help of an army of monkeys, and by the monkey king Sugriva, and the general of that army is named Hanuman, so he played a big role in that as well. And they actually built a bridge from India to Sri Lanka, where they were able to then go to Sri Lanka and invade it and kill this nasty Ravana, this 10-headed demon king. But that's not the end of the story, though. They didn't all necessarily live happily ever after, because Rama gets Sita back, and then he goes back and becomes king in his father's place. But the people there suspect that Sita, while she was held hostage or held captive in Sri Lanka, that she was not chaste during that time, that she actually practiced some infidelity. Now, it's not shown there was any truth to this, but these were the rumors that were going around, and Rama didn't believe it either. He knew that Sita was totally legit and on the up and up. but in order to appease his constituents, he had to banish her. Now, when he banished her, they had already had children. They had twins, and when the twins got older, he went out and sought Sita. And when he comes to her with their children to reunite, she doesn't want to reunite. She's decided to call upon the earth to open and swallow her. And the text ends with Rama and his kingdom going to the Saraya River, and there they enter the body of Vishnu. So the idea is that sometimes you have to make sacrifices in order to do what you think is right. So we see a theme here of people doing what they didn't want to do. So Rama's dad banished him to appease his wife, and then Rama acted heroically and rescued his wife from this 10-headed demon king. But then after that, even when they became king and queen, he had to banish Sita, even though he didn't want to. He felt that it was his duty, just given the situation. That was the best thing to do. And then Sita, even though she wanted to come back, decided that no, that she needed to be absorbed into the earth, and that was for, on her own spiritual journey and well-being. And then it sounds like Rama and the other people of this kingdom decide to be absorbed into Vishnu also. So there's this idea of sacrificing what you want for your spiritual well-being and for the common good. And now for the Puranas. So this is the period then after the epics. Oh no, I'm sorry. Looks like it was concurrent. So the Puranas were from 500 BC to 500 AD as well. There are 18 Puranas. And let me turn to this real quick to kind of give you a better description, so I'm not just not just going off the top of my head here. The Puranas are, I think that it literally means stories of the ancient past. So the Puranas are stories of the ancient past. They would have been recited at gatherings by specialists who were traditionally the sons of Kshatriya fathers and Brahman mothers. And today they are recited by special individuals known by the Hindi term Bhat. The Puranas have traditionally been classified according to three qualities, which are inherent in existence, namely the quality of light or purity, passion, and darkness or inertia. So again, there are 18 Puranas, and you can see those in the photo. Then there's the Upanishads, and Upanishad literally means to sit near. So picture the idea of students gathered around a circle. So if you have a teacher sitting up in a chair or something, and then the students kind of sit at the feet of that teacher, they're listening to the teacher and hanging on his every word. That's kind of what that term Upanishad refers to when it says sitting near. So like students sitting near to a teacher to listen to what he has to say. Upanishads are known as the end of the Veda. And they interprets the meaning of ritual, so Vedic ritual. So the Upanishads are connected to the Vedas. There's over 200 Upanishads total. Most of them range from 600 to 100 BC. And again, they're defined within the Vedic traditions. They place emphasis on a more personal religious experience and internal meditation. So it seems interesting, while they're entrenched in Vedic tradition and ideology, they also kind of point to what we'll begin to see later in the epics and with the Bhagavad-Gita, especially the path of devotion and the path of knowledge. So those are the Upanishads. And there's the Dhamma Shastras, which were from 600 to 100 BC, and that also includes the well-known law code of Manu. So again, this is just a very brief introduction to Hinduism. I may do future videos on some aspects. So we could probably do videos just on a particular Veda alone. So we could do a series of videos just on the Rig Veda, for example. Probably won't do anything like that, but I find the epics and Puranas a lot more interesting, especially the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad-Gita. So there are multiple things in Hinduism that can be explored on their own. There's just such a massive amount of information, like I said at the beginning. But hopefully, going over these terms and concepts and ideas and some of the main scriptures of Hinduism has given you some idea of what these folks believe and where they're coming from. And at least we have some kind of basis if we meet someone who is a Hindu to have a good dialogue. Maybe we'll have some idea of what they believe and where they're coming from, but then they can kind of help direct us as far as what they believe personally, because every Hindu, like I said, is different. So I know this was a lot of information, but I hope that you found some of it to be useful. So once again, thank you very much for watching and listening, and God bless.